Could you describe the difference between a cult and a Christian denomination? What makes the distinction? That's actually a very good question on what is the difference between a cult and a Christian denomination. And I want to bring up the word heresy. I just read an article earlier this week, I believe, or perhaps it was last weekend, an article on the sickness and discernment ministries. And this is somewhat related to that question on discernment ministries. And the issue that I didn't really go into too much on the article, but the issue that needs to be discussed is, what is a heresy? Because there's a lot of heresy talk thrown out there. He's a heretic, she's a heretic, they're heretics, everybody's a heretic. And I think that it would be a very good study, and I plan to do it one of these days because I've been called a heretic a number of times, but to go through and figure out what really is heresy and what is not heresy. I think there is such a thing as being wrong, and I thought I was wrong once, but it turned out I wasn't. I hope you caught the humor there. And there is something that is being wrong, and there's something that is being heretical. So what's the difference between wrong, a different interpretation, and obviously you can even take, for example, millennial positions, amillennialist, postmillennialist, and premillennialist, and the various positions within premillennialism, historical premillennialism, and dispensational premillennialism. And there are, as much as it pains me to say it, there are some good believers in all those camps, and they're going to, when they're absent from the body, they're going to be present with the Lord. They are saved. Their faith is in Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. They're wrong, and we can't all be right. So we have to come and say there's a difference between being wrong and being a heretic. Now, your question, Scott, relates to this, and what's the difference, or what is it that brings about the designation that we would give for cult? Sometimes someone will tell us, the Baptists are a cult and the Methodists are a cult. And in a very a simple term, just the English word cult basically means people who stand a little different from the norm and they're together in a group. But you and I all know that we in our circles of Christianity use the term cult to refer to some group, religious group, that is teaching heresy to the point that you cannot follow that doctrine towards salvation. And I think that really does become the turning point there on, are they just wrong or are they a cult? When I was in seminary, and I've got somewhere in all these books here, I'm sure still got the book, we had a book by Dr. Anthony Honega, I believe his name was, and he's an amillennialist. But the book was four major cults. And the four major cults, if memory serves me correctly, were the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witness, Christian Scientists, and the fourth one, then, might surprise you, was the Seventh-day Adventist. And in that day, and this was in the 80s, Seventh-day Adventists were considered a cult. Today, they're not so much considered a cult. Now, I remember from the book even that back there in the 80s, they were saying the Seventh-day Adventists are making some changes to their belief system. And even in that book said, someday we may have to go down to three major cults. So should Seventh-day Adventists be considered a cult? There was a time for Seventh-day Adventists, for example, when their teaching about how to be saved just wouldn't work biblically. And so it had to be considered a cult. Now, I think their Christology and their understanding of grace has changed. And though they still continue to worship on Saturdays, they don't worship on Saturdays anymore in order to be saved, as at one time that was the only way you could be saved. If you were not worshiping on Saturday in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you simply were not going to be saved. So I think I would draw that line then on, does the teaching of that particular group Can their soteriology, that is their teaching about salvation, can it lead to salvation, or is it opposed to salvation? If it doesn't lead to salvation, then I think we have to call it a cult. Now, that gets into some interesting things about, what about Catholicism? And Orthodox types of groups that teach a very different kind of salvation than evangelical Christianity. And I think that we really some serious study needs to be put on this. So I'm not really going to give a full answer, because I think that somebody needs to write a book on it, honestly, and say, what is a cult and what is a heretic, and bring all that about. I think it's a great question. I appreciate you bringing that up, Scott.